Demons, whether as fallen angels, preternatural intelligences, or supernatural beasts, remain the object of perennial fascination. From video games and horror films to the actual uptick in exorcisms in recent years, the world of the demonic has and will likely hold human interest. Of course, the reasons for these fascinations are dramatically over-determined, from questions of theodicy or the origin of evil on the philosophical and theological side of things, to occult practices which seek to bind and control such beings, and of course a dozen reasons in between. Just where does our knowledge of such beings originate? How do we know anything at all about the nature and doings of demons? In this episode, I want to explore just that question by turning back over a millennium to the Byzantine intellectual Michael Psellus and his foundationally important work, Περι ενεργειas daemonon dialogos, rendered into Latin as de operatione daemonum, or more simply as de demonibus, rendered most typically as on the operations of demons, or more succinctly, just on demons. This text, written about the year 1050 of the Common Era, is perhaps one of the most fundamental demonological texts in the history of the Western world, and has influenced everyone from Inquisitors to witch-hunters to occultists and skeptics alike. If you're interested in demonology, the academic study of the occult, or Hermetic philosophy more generally, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really do appreciate your consideration of supporting this channel and the project that is Esoterica. Now let's turn to this classic text on the nature and operations of demons. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. In the history of Hermetic and occult philosophy, the names of a few luminaries always stand out: Ficino, Pico, Dee, Bruno, Paracelsus, and of course their inheritors such as the Theosophists and the modern occultists, along of course with neo-pagans. In that list, you will rarely find the name of the 11th century Byzantine savant and polymath Michael Psellus, and this is not only a serious mistake, but it's also a bit tragic. Why? Because without Psellus, Hermetic philosophy and the occult revival that followed in its wake may have never happened. You see, Psellus likely single-handedly preserved many of the pagan Platonic and Hermetic texts from antiquity. For instance, there is good, though admittedly controversial, reason to believe that the Corpus Hermeticum as we have it was in fact edited together by Michael Psellus. In fact, in the manuscripts that preserve all 17 Hermetic logoi, various interpolations of Psellus can be seen, including the very famous one at Corpus Hermeticum 1:18, where he argues that this wizard, or goes, that's the root of the word for Goetia, must have known the biblical story attributed to Moses. He thinks of the writer of this text as a kind of wizard who's weaving biblical text into a larger pagan framework. Of course, Psellus's preservation of the text is a double-edged sword. While he did flirt mightily with pagan philosophy, which nearly got him excommunicated on a few occasions, he was also clear about the supremacy of Christianity, and that while the pagan could perhaps accidentally come upon some truth, such philosophy was always a pale shadow compared to the truth of Christianity. So while he may have likely preserved the Corpus Hermeticum, it may be just as likely that what survived did so only by passing through this filter of Psellus's theological commitments. This isn't only true for the Corpus Hermeticum, but for other such texts such as the Encyclopedic Kestoi of Africanus, the Hieratic Art of Proclus. That's a text, by the way, that basically underwrites Agrippa's entire theory of magic. Along with the Chaldean Oracles, a text that Psellus believed fundamentally informed both Aristotle and Plato, but also Proclus, for whom Psellus had a profound admiration. While Psellus's own philosophical output doesn't prove decisive, he is decisive, maybe the decisive link in the chain, which preserved the pagan wisdom of the late classical world such that it could become the foundation of the Hermetic and Occult revivals in the centuries following the 15th century publication of books like the Corpus Hermeticum. In this way, it's hard to downplay just how important he was. But this episode isn't about the preservation of pagan wisdom, it's about demons, and so let's turn to his text on the operations of demons. So, this is a point in the episode where I have to say that there's scholarly debate about whether or not the text was even written by Psellus. Gautier, the principal editor of the modern critical edition of the text, argues against Psellus's authorship and actually denotes the author as pseudo-Psellus. However, in more recent publications, both Cortesi and Maltese argue that the text is authentically Psellus. Now, I'm going to put that question over here, and you can go read those articles and sort out what you think, but I'm just going to proceed to the text itself, Psellus or pseudo-Psellus notwithstanding. The text as we have it has been long attributed to him, and in some ways it doesn't really matter whether he wrote it or not. It seems to bear his mark and has made a decisive impact regardless of the question of authorship. The text of On the Operations of Demons takes the form of a dialogue between a certain Timothy and Thracian. I'm still not sure if that's like a toponym or his actual name, but whatever. Wherein, after traveling about, Thracian informs Timothy about the terrible religious practices of the Euchites, specifically their dealings with demons. This discussion eventually pivots to Thracian answering Timothy's questions about the nature of demons and the operations or going about of demons more generally. The Euchites, or the Massalians if you're curious, were a Christian sect that centralized constant and intense prayer, hence their name, it means the ones that pray, rather than ecclesiastical intercession or the other sacraments, and generally held a rather intensely dualistic worldview. They were possibly influenced by Manichaeism. The text even takes a couple pot shots at Mani and his faith, and they seem to have influenced the later Bogomils and in turn the Cathars, though modern scholarship is much less confident as to the existence of such organized groups as such. Despite this, the Euchites were condemned as early as 383 of the Common Era and were perceived by the church as having reached Central Europe by the 13th century, as evidenced by a condemnation by the Bishop of Trier around that time. Again, what happens in the minds of bishops and inquisitors and what's really going on the ground doesn't always match. The existence of the early modern witch heresy being the textbook case. I mean, it was basically a giant conspiracy theory that got 60,000 women killed. So Psellus's On the Operations of Demons is actually meant to be a kind of anti-Manichaean, anti-Euchite tract, but in the centuries that followed, that aspect was largely ignored, and often when the text was reprinted in popular editions, the beginning of the dialogue about how evil the Euchites were is actually just edited out, such that only the demonological sections remain. So how does the argument actually go here? Well, something like this. These heretics commune with demons to achieve a wide range of supposed powers. How? By debasing themselves primarily through consuming excrement, engaging in incestuous orgies, and sacrificing the children born of such unions to the demons. The idea here is that if the soul isn't totally debased, it still bears some marks of divine goodness which inhibit communion with the demons. Thus, such debasing activities drives away any remaining goodness to facilitate communion with said demons. Now, already there is a lot going on in these slurs against the Euchites. There's no reason to believe that the Euchites actually engage in things like this. First, we should note the origin of these slurs. Ironically, this somewhat stereotypical laundry list of debasing evil, excrement consumption, incest, and cannibalism actually first appears in Roman pagan slurs against early Christians. Yes, what we have here is a Christian repackaging of old Roman anti-Christian slurs to be used against other Christians. It's a good old cycle of trauma violence. Similar libel was also hurled at the Gnostics during those heady pre-Nicene days and following. Secondly, these exact same stereotypically evil activities will also form the foundation for conspiracy theory accounts of the so-called witches' Sabbath and also the anti-Semitic blood libels that generated in the Middle Ages in the centuries following Psellus. Now, Psellus isn't wholly responsible for these myths, but On the Operations of Demons was such a foundational textbook, again, for witch hunters, inquisitors, but also for occult philosophers such as Agrippa. So it's worth mentioning that even if he's not completely responsible, he does eventually add to the discourse of the kind of conspiracy theory thinking that survives all the way to this day with QAnon. At any rate, after introducing how the Euchites commune with demons via ritual debasement, the rest of the conversation turns to the topic at hand, the nature and operation of the demons themselves. So how does Thracian come to know what he knows about these demons? Well, during his travels, he met a hermit monk named Marcus in Mesopotamia, who spent some years of his life practicing black magic and communing with the demons. However, Marcus had since repented, but shared with Thracian what he had learned about the demons during his stint as a necromancer. Now, I'm going to speculate a little bit here. This backstory about a reformed Mesopotamian necromancer who reveals what he knows about the world of the demonic just strikes me as so similar to the backstory of the Necronomicon in the works of H.P. Lovecraft or the Simon version of the Necronomicon that I suspect there might be some connection here between Psellus's On the Operation of Demons and the Necronomicon. Again, On the Operations of Demons would have been the locus classicus for any background reading on the subject, and this parallel just seems a bit striking to me. Lovecraft or the Simon Necronomicon aside, what do we learn about the demons from the hermit Marcus? First, we learn that unlike angels, demons do, at least now, have a kind of corporeal body, which depending on the type of demon is always rather a kind of fine ethereal substance. Further, they're able to communicate with human beings, though not through sounds. Rather, they're able to make direct impressions, so to speak, upon the human imagination, which can, as you might imagine, render people stark raving mad and generally insane and evil. Such beings, despite not having genitals, are able to produce a kind of seminal fluid through the shedding of some aspect of their body. This sperm is actually said to transform into worms or maggots. Demons are also said to require nutrition, which they absorb from living creatures around them or more directly through possession. And this brings us to the demonic taxonomy at the very heart of On the Operations of Demons. Here we learn that such beings can be divided into 6 groups. There are the 4 elemental demonic species beginning just under the moon with the igneous demons, followed by the aerial demons, the terrestrial demons, and of course the aqueous demons. Also, we have a species which is perpetually subterranean, and finally we have the light-fleeing demons, or the lucifugous demons, the ones that run away from the light. The temperament and intelligence of the demons also corresponds with their genetic conditions, which part of the universe they come from, with the igneous and aerial being more intelligent and the subterranean and light fleers being much more akin to wild animals, barely sentient at all, the text says. Further, the demonic nature also determines their mode of possession and attack, but also the kind of nourishment they require. The aqueous demons subject people to humid suffocation, while the subterranean demons just seem to rip people apart. The aerial demons more subtly distort the mind, tending those people to sinful lust and eventually into insanity. The light-fleeing demons reduce the body to total lethargy and wasting. Again, this is accomplished by enticing the human mind to make it ripe for eventual possession via subtle cues by a kind of direct communication via the demon into the mind of the victim, and not through direct linguistic communication. It's almost something like a modern conception of an intrusive thought. The demons can impress things upon your mind that you don't want there and can begin the process of manipulating you in order to possess you. Further, it's possible for a demon to enter into the body of an animal, especially to feast upon their heat, as is the case for the subterranean demons who are perpetually racked with cold. Of course, physicians are skeptical that these conditions are brought about by demons, and Thracian admits that he too was pretty skeptical of this until he witnessed cases of demonic possession, which confirmed for him what he learned from the hermit Marcus. Finally, we learn that demons can take on various forms and that demons do not have a gender. Rather, they take on whatever appearance will facilitate their agenda, which can range from seducing a person to just terrifying them into submission. The demons are likened to clouds, which can move and shift and form, whereby our imagination plays the important part of projecting our own lusts and fears, which are then mirrored back to us, a situation capitalized upon by the demonic forces. Though the ability to shapeshift relies on the creative powers of the demons, which again range from the most creative, intelligent of those which have their origins in the stellar world or the sublunar world close to the moon, to those barely sentient deep underground. Perhaps the most famous part of Psellos' On the Operation of Demons are his description of why demons are especially afraid of iron implements, specifically swords. Pain, Thracian reminds us, is not located in a damaged bone or nerve, but rather in the spirit of the injured. Thus, the demons, being made of a kind of spiritual substance, are capable of being injured just as we are. In fact, it's easy to injure certain spirits given their very ethereal nature. Thus, a sword can cleave an aerial demon in twain, causing them immense agony, though, just like air or water, they quickly come back together, just as passing your hand through a pool only briefly separates the water. This kind of reminds me of the liquid metal T-1000 Terminator from Terminator 2 who can be injured, I guess, but morphs right back into shape. Thus, the demons are rightly terrified of iron implements, especially swords. This notion has had a huge impact on necromantic and magical practice more generally. The image of the necromancer wielding a ceremonial sword or dagger would eventually become a standard image, and such implements have become part of the trade of magical practice all the way until this very day. The image of the ceremonial sword or dagger is just part and parcel of modern ceremonial magic, and the elements of that probably go back, at least in some substantial part, to Michael Psellus. We also learn that at least some demons do have mild prescience or foreknowledge of things to come, but the details are scant as the dialogue between Timothy and Thracian comes to a rather abrupt end. So why would one debase oneself and subject oneself to such beings, to be possessed and destroyed? For Psellus, mostly for want of power, lust, or vainglory, which such beings are happy to promise but can never truly deliver upon. only offering up illusions while they wait for the moment to pounce and feed off their hapless victims. Much like Augustine, Psellus sees the operation of demons as seducing people into a trap, all the while viewing them and their souls as mere nourishment. In this way, Psellus's text reads a bit like those nature shows where creatures in the natural world are described going about the business of surviving, or not, in nature. The lion on the prowl, the owl stalking a field mouse, the bear chomping away at a salmon. But here we learn about the ultimate demonic predators and how we are, in fact, the prey. And in that way, the text is rather chilling. Psellus's rather brief on the operation of demons proved to be incredibly influential after it appeared in Ficino's opera Omnia in 1497, itself being reprinted at least 4 times in the 16th century. In fact, I own a little Hermetic reader which includes a range of such texts as Procluses on the Hieratic Art and the Corpus Hermeticum, along with an excerpted form of On the Operations of Demons printed in 1577. The text would go on to make a substantial impact on the demonological theories in the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa, who relies heavily on the text. Both Ben Jonson and the famed poet John Milton rely on the text for their discussion of demons, with Milton's Paradise Lost often directly echoing ideas from Michael Psellus, which went on, of course, to be just a huge part of the canon of Western literature. As you can imagine, the text would also go on to play an important role in the emergent early modern witch trials. For instance, Psellus's Demonic Taxonomy would appear in the very popular witch hunting manual, the Compendium Maleficarum, published in 1608 at the height of the trials. Both Reginald Scott and Johann Weyer, one of the students of Cornelius Agrippa, represent the arguments laid out by Psellus, though they do inaugurate a bit more of a skeptical attitude toward the text. Though Cardano's De Rerum Veritate, published in 1577, very much kept the lights on with its extensive summary of the text. The text also appears in Burton's famed Anatomy of Melancholy, one of the earliest texts providing a sustained analysis of what we would now call mental illness, especially clinical depression. It was also marshaled into service by the Cambridge Platonists in their pitched battle with the Cartesian materialist mechanical philosophy of that time. Though by the 18th century, the importance of the text was on the wane, but its tremendous impact had certainly been made and continues to be felt at virtually all registers of demonological studies, but also everywhere from the appearance of demons in popular culture or contemporary occult practices. Psellus's On the Operation of Demons is a text which underwrites the entire genre of demonology and thus warrants careful reading and analysis. The standard critical edition of On the Operations of Demons is the text by Gautier, which is accompanied with their French translation. To my knowledge, this is the only reliable academic translation of the text. Luckily, however, it is accessible for open access, and I'll include a link for it below. The 1843 Collisson translation into English is serviceable, but has serious shortcomings. For instance, in parts of the text that would have been too shocking to Victorian sensibilities, like the incest and child sacrifices or the demonic semen, demon semen turning into worms and maggots, Collisson just leave those sections in Latin. And even in the recent edition by Skinner, they remain in Latin and aren't even translated in the footnotes. I mean, yeah, it's kind of gross and shocking, but it's really not acceptable in a contemporary edition not to render the entire text. You just can't leave stuff in Latin because it's gross. If you're curious about Byzantine demonology more generally, which does bear on the eventual development of Solomonic magic just generally, the standard text there is Traditions of Belief in Late Byzantine Demonology by Greenfield, though that text is pretty hard to find. Again, make sure to subscribe, check out my other content on topics in the occult, demonology, and esotericism, and I'd hope you consider supporting my work of making scholarly and free content on topics like this on YouTube for free by taking a look at my Patreon or considering a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and I really appreciate you watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.